Yeah.
All right.
Okay, yeah, we're good. Okay, so I was going to ask, so in terms of the connections, what would you say they are between, let's say, misogyny and the sort of current political climate and fascism, or the rise of it?
So I think these things are connected. Fascist movements historically have been pronatal,
Yeah.
and they've been focused on ideas of entrenched hierarchies, in which men were not only on top, but traditional masculinity or ideas of traditional masculinity were a way to harken back to some sort of, longed for nostalgic past.
Yeah.
And I think these anti-abortion laws are a culmination of all of these forces. That they're taking place in the South, I don't think is a mistake for, a number of different reasons. But most notably, the immigration crisis that's happening on our southern border.
Yeah.
This is being used to fuel racism. It's being used to fuel xenophobia. In fact, researchers have said that some of these anti-abortion marches or some of these alt-right marches are some of the greatest recruiting grounds for white supremacist movements. And I think these laws sort of coincide with these racist and xenophobic ideas that immigration is going to lead to a great white genocide. And it's a way of policing primarily brown and black bodies because they tend to be most heavily impacted by these laws, and as a warning sign to other women for what's at stake if they don't get in line and support these traditional gender roles. I don't think it's an accident that these laws are not only going after abortion, but many of them are also attacking certain forms of contraception, which are very much not abortion.
And what would you say are some of the cruelest aspects of these laws?
I would say their disproportionate impact on women who are already vulnerable and marginalized. As Elizabeth Warren recently said, women's of means are always going to be able to get abortions. If you have the resources for, bus or airfare, you're going to be able to get somewhere with an abortion, where you can get an abortion. But if you work in a low-paying job, you may not be able to get the multiple days off in a row that are required for some of these states that have waiting periods. You may not be able to afford the procedure itself if you miss a number of days of work in a row. And so what's most alarming to me is that these laws are going to hurt the people who are least able to absorb it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so interesting with Kate. She talks about essentially what she calls misogynoir. Well, I don't, that wasn't necessarily her concept, but I like obviously that she interjected.
One more time, what's the concept?
So it's called misogynoir. So Jamie, well, how would you define misogynoir?
So this is something that I don't have a lot of expertise here on, and so I'm going to sort of follow Kate's example by being very careful into it. But misogynoir is the sort of misogyny that's directed at Black women in particular, and sort of, or not sort of, but leverages these sexist and racist tropes about Black women. And so, for example, Black women are often described to or referred to as hypersexualized. The way that they're portrayed in the media sort of makes caricatures of their bodies in ways that are highly sexualized. Or there's the trope of the angry Black woman to sort of delegitimize the anger that's experienced at both the sexism and racism that they're tasked with navigating.
Yeah. So there's a sort of intersection of different forms of, let's say, of oppression and different forms of cruelty, where they come in together, and it's like it's a combination of factors that essentially kind of keep people and beat them down.
Yeah, because
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so you see this often too, and very often by white men, where they will sort of try to reframe the discussion around abortion about how it's actually Planned Parenthood or Democrats are racist because Planned Parenthood and abortion is killing more Black babies. And completely devoid from this context is why it is that Black women are having abortions. And also ignoring the fact that many of women generally, and Black women in particular, already have children at home when they're choosing to do this. And it's a refusal to engage with the material reality of women's lives and the policies that make lives be lived out in this way.
Yeah. And Alan, you wanted to say something?
No, I mean, that should be discussed more in the mainstream. That sounds like a very nuanced point. It seems like, yeah, they're talking about how Planned Parenthood is at fault, the Democrats. But yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there are some women who already have children who are making the decision to have an abortion, or also not necessarily discussing why is it that, let's say in this particular case, Black women are having more abortions. Why is there no discussion around that? Maybe we should be looking at little points like that.
I want to be careful. I'm not actually sure it's correct to say that Black women are having more abortions. I would have to double check that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm learning here. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
no, that's fine.
Yeah.
I just want to be very careful,
yeah.
especially talking about this. Like, I'm already sort of bracing for like the kind of hate mail that's going to slide into my DMs when this airs.
Yeah, I mean, that's also kind of inevitable. I mean, we kind of get that too sometimes. It's just like, I mean, sometimes you can say something that's just misinterpreted, and that's just sort of the way it is.
Yeah, so I don't actually think it's correct that Black women are having more abortions.
Yeah.
But it is certainly true. I think the statistic is 60% of women who do have abortions already have children.
Right.
And so when we talk about it being, this Planned Parenthood is racist because they're actually trying to, carry out the work of Black eugenics,
Right.
it's ignoring the reason why women have abortions.
Yeah.
And it's sort of trying to camouflage the racism inherent in some of the passage of these laws. Because if just reducing abortions was the real goal, there are more successful ways of doing this. As we've seen in Colorado, you can make birth control free and accessible, and that will cause the unplanned pregnancy rate to plummet.
Right.
You can also provide material support to single moms,
Mm-hmm.
but that's also something that doesn't want to be done, because if you embolden single moms and you remove their need to rely on fathers to provide materially for the children,
Yep.
then all of a sudden you've made males seemingly irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very scary concept for the very people who are passing these laws.
Yep.
And so it seems quite obvious to me, at least, that the goal is not to reduce abortions, but it's to keep women in a position of dependency.
Yeah. And what's so interesting to me is on the left. And look, I know we talked last week a little bit about Bill Maher. And look, I do like the guy, and there's sort of definitely great facets of sort of his work and his comedy. But I think, like, for the most part, and I think this is erroneous, not just on kind of his part, but on sort of a lot of people on the left, is that when we frame these abortion sort of debates and discussions, right, we kind of frame them in the context of religion. And it becomes, let's say, explained in such a way of like, okay, why are we using religion, right, to sort of answer these questions? When really the bigger question in this context is, why is this allowed in terms of how does this sort of fit in the bigger context of the sort of bigger picture of misogyny? So rather than framing it as a religious question, I think it's more important to frame it as a question of patriarchy. How is this a manifestation of patriarchy? How does this sort of manifest male dominance? And in terms of religion or not, right, why is it that we're still doing this thing that's obviously hurting a whole sector of the population, in this case, particularly women?
Yeah, so I'm gonna leave Bill Maher to the side.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, I find the religious argument to be largely a farce, for a number of reasons. One, when Roe v. Wade was first passed in 1973, the religious right didn't actually have this sort of vitriolic response to it until 6 years later. Mm-hmm. And the response to Roe v. Wade that came 6 years later was really a political rallying tool to provide a defeat for Jimmy Carter, and to sort of form commonalities amongst people who are upset about integration in the South. Mm-hmm. And this idea that anti-abortion is justified by religion just isn't actually borne out by reality. Yeah. The Old Testament itself includes a passage for how to cause a miscarriage. As a punishment, in terms of when it defines life. The absolute very earliest is at quickening, when you can actually start to feel the fetus move. But then there's also passages where it defines the beginning of life as when the first breath is taken. Yeah. So this is just not borne out in the scripture. And even the evangelical movement that I mentioned earlier, in the aftermath of 1973, the consensus was that this was a fairly reasonable decision that did the right thing in prioritizing the health and welfare of the mother. It wasn't until years later that they realized that this could be an effective political tool and means for acquiring power.